Viewed under the microscope, magnified tens of thousands of times, this is the bacteria called Neisseria gonorrhoeae, more commonly known as gonorrhea. It comes from the 14th century Latin word meaning the flow of the seed. It's mentioned in the Bible. In Leviticus 15, they speak of men with certain discharges being unclean. But how do we know about it? And what have we done to find out more about it? Welcome to the Curious Man's Guide to Gonorrhea. Say hello to Henry. Hello, Henry. Henry doesn't have gonorrhea, but he's going to use the medium of his instrument to describe what he imagines gonorrhea feels like. Thank you, Henry. Gonorrhea. The clap. Cockrot. Call it what you will, it's not a nice thing to have. It's the second most common sexually transmitted infection in the UK, and it's been with us for centuries. In the 1800s, some doctors believed it was created when ladies had sex whilst on their period. Wartime posters warned soldiers of the dangers of dirty girls, and up until the discovery of penicillin in the mid-20th century, the treatment, called urethral sounding, could be pretty painful to say the least. But why is it so rampant? And who was, at the very least, partly responsible for its spreading? I'll tell you who. Old school prostitutes. In the 16th century, Georgian London was full to the brim of them. In fact, records suggest that at its peak, due to terrible wages and working conditions, 1 in 5 London ladies were trying a bit of whoring. As an example of just how rife 16th century prostitution was, take a look at this. This book is called Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies. It's a bit like a Yellow Pages, but for working girls. Or a Prostatages. Huh? Published every year from 1757 to 1795 for the price of 2 shillings and sixpence, it described everything about all the known working girls in London, their age, their sexual specialties, and most importantly, whether or not they were well spoken. For instance, this particular edition tells us that although Miss Young could prove irresistible after unveiling her Venus to you, her smallpox was more than a little off-putting. With so much prostitution taking place, it's not really surprising to learn that London was swarming with STIs. The condom, by that point only recently invented by the awesomely named Dr. Condom, consisted of a bit of sheep's intestine fastened by a ribbon, and for some reason, people didn't like the idea of that. So, a lot of men having rampant, frequent, unprotected sex with even more prostitutes. That's a lot of trips to the doctor, who would more often than not prescribe the treatment of the time, injecting the area of infection with mercury. You know, the stuff that's incredibly poisonous, that stuff. Let me introduce you to one such doctor, John Hunter. As he was a doctor in a time when everyone was having what appeared to be an STI-flavoured pants party, Dr. John, not that one, had seen more than his fair share in his patients, not just gonorrhea, but syphilis as well. He became well informed on both diseases, so much so that in 1767 he came up with a theory. He thought that gonorrhea and syphilis weren't two separate things, but different manifestations of the same illness. In order to test this theory out, all he needed to do was to deliberately infect a volunteer with gonorrhea, someone who never had an STI in their entire life. If within a few weeks they also showed symptoms of syphilis, it'd prove him right. Now, funnily enough, no one wanted to be infected with a nasty STI. He got no volunteers. And so that's why on a dark night in 1767, he took a knife laden with gonorrhea-filled pus and, as you would, jabbed it into his own penis. And what happened? Well, it gave him gonorrhea, which, to all intents and purposes, looks horrible. In fact, gonorrhea looks so bad, I'm not going to even show you what it looks like. Instead, here's a list of things it doesn't look like. Unbeknown to Dr. Hunter, the pus he infected himself with also contained syphilis. So after a few weeks, when he started showing symptoms of both diseases, he drew the wrong conclusion and went straight to the powers that be with his findings, even though they were
completely wrong.
So let's recap. Not only had a well-respected doctor just stuck a dirty great knife into his bell end for no reason, his actions also managed to set the course of medical research back by half a century. But hey, he didn't mind. His writing on the subject had by this point earned him a certain celebrity status, and 9 years later he was appointed personal surgeon to King George III.
Of course, this was the king that went mad a few years later, but that's another story.